Welcome again, everyone. My name is Brian Balicki, your host of the podcast, The Juice is Worth the Squeeze. Embrace it. It's my life story of 56 years as a type 1 diabetic and still counting. This is the fifth episode of Season 1. It's been a little while since my last podcast. After the first 4 episodes, I took a short break. I wanted to step back and evaluate all aspects of what I've produced so far. I believe the trajectory has been great, and the content is sound, and the best is still to come. My viewers and listeners now cover 3 continents, 5 countries, and 17 cities. Interestingly, the most widely visited episodes are the very first, an overview of my life story, and the most recent one, the fateful and violent night in June 1968 that began my 56-plus year journey as a type 1 diabetic. Today's podcast will focus on the personal and physiological changes that immediately followed that fateful night in 1968 I described in my prior episode. Today's podcast is titled My Discovery and Diagnosis as a type 1 diabetic. It recounts what my personal transition was like to becoming a type 1 during the months July through September of 1968. Coincidentally, this period mirrors pretty closely the 3 stages of the onset for type 1 diabetes that the American Diabetes Association talks about in its own educational materials today. I previewed these in my YouTube video intro for today's podcast. Unfortunately, none of this knowledge existed back in 1968. That's the bad news. Had it been more widely available back then, I've wondered how it might have changed how my doctors, my family, and I responded to my earliest symptoms of type 1. The good news is, despite this void and not being available and the near-death circumstances that I presented to my doctors when I was admitted to a hospital in fall 1968, I survived. 56 years later, I've never once yet been hospitalized. No devastating, complicating conditions to this point, and very lucky to be alive, active, and in generally good health today. But before I begin, I'd like to share a few quick updates. My podcasting audience continues to grow on the major distribution channels: Apple, Amazon, Spotify, iHeart, and the newest entry, Podchaser. I also want really to emphasize there are video versions of all of my audio podcasts. They exist on YouTube under the title Brian Balicki, The Juice. Yes, just simply type those words in the search box at YouTube and the video versions of all podcasts should appear there. The multimedia podcasts appear only at YouTube. Between the audio-only outlets for my podcasts and YouTube, there's actually very little difference in their content. I appreciate that my followers have grown in number on all of the distribution channels, but my favorite is actually YouTube. I like YouTube's multimedia format best because it is best suited for sharing certain important details of my lifelong experiences as a type 1 diabetic by adding some visual aids, graphics, and video footage to back up my life story. I think the multimedia format will become even more relevant in my future podcasts. 2 other notes. You may have noticed that I do not charge for listening to my podcast currently. This is purposeful. I want my messaging on type 1 and my 56-year life story to be distributed as widely as possible to diabetics across the globe and to all their caregivers and supporters in their own lifelong journeys. I believe my podcasts offer tangible, tested advice, hope, and value in managing the lifelong challenges of living with type 1. My life story is living proof that reasonable control of type 1 should not be sacrificed in pursuit of perfect control. Perfect control, I believe, is unnecessary. Why? Reasonable control creates far less risks for those things like low blood sugar, it's less stressful, and has comparable lifelong outcomes. Yes, comparable outcomes. When I compare my general health and activity levels to those of friends and family of roughly my age, I'm happy. No complaints. I am usually as healthy, if not more so, than my peers. If you take anything away from my podcast, take that one lesson. Reasonable control works and makes it much easier to embrace type 1 diabetes over a lifetime. It works and has done so for me for 56 plus years. Having said all that, I wanted to announce today that I've created a GoFundMe page. Yes, use your search button and type in the words GoFundMe, Brian Balicki, The Juice. My picture and a short description of the purpose for my fundraising project will be explained there. I did this to jumpstart a fundraising campaign to accelerate the publication of my planned book. Yes, I've talked about this before, and I finished the writing part of my book. But as I've gotten deeper into the business side of publishing, I've realized the cost of publishing, while not astronomical, are beyond the limited means of a retired senior citizen like me. So I'm seeking a modest sum of money to help me finish with my book publication. I also want to be sure I can maintain full control of its final content, distribution, and proceeds. Your donations now at GoFundMe will help me to do just that. But most importantly, my big picture view of the purpose and ultimate aim of my book has become clearer to me. At a certain point, I want the proceeds from the future sales of books to be reinvested in special, small projects to help type 1 diabetics manage their conditions. Yes, there are little things I've found that have not yet been published in the literature, and if they were, I believe would help all type 1s to be able to better manage themselves as they age. I have ideas about how to do this, so please stay tuned or write me if you'd like to discuss further. My dream is to have the proceeds fund what I call everyday needs, common sense solutions to managing type 1, and to distribute my own lifetime tested suggestions for managing type 1 diabetes as well. These are an interim, proven set of suggestions to help you with living until a cure can be found. I mention this because I've grown increasingly frustrated with the more common institutionally based or corporate based initiatives that I see presented in the media these days. To be clear, I'm not poo-pooing or throwing shade on the unbelievable medicines, tools, and technologies that have evolved to help me and many other diabetics meet the daily challenges in managing type 1. To the contrary, while these advances have been life-changing, I've learned in my 56 plus years is that there's limits to the wonderful medicines, devices, and technologies that exist to support people like me, type 1 diabetics today. For sure, they've played a major role in my life. I devote a chapter to this in my book. However, my experience has shown that how you use these life-changing and life-saving resources, how you trust and learn from them, and avoid stressing about them is essential to your long-term success in managing your condition. I'll be sharing more of my thoughts on these issues in coming podcasts. Again, I am living proof that you should trust them, but also verify. While they are effective, understand that reasonable and not necessarily perfect control of your diabetes should be sufficient to reach a healthy lifestyle as you age. Take control of your devices, yes, but be sure don't let them take control of you. Finally, I'd like to encourage you to continue sharing your comments on my podcast. I truly thank you for them. They confirm that my message is getting out to diabetics and the public at large. Remember, after today's podcast, share your comments at fanlist.com/thejuice. Again, that's fanlist.com/thejuice. And now to today's podcast. It begins with the point I made in today's intro if you saw the video version of my YouTube podcast. If you listen to my prior podcast about the history leading up to my diagnosis and the circumstances surrounding my type 1 diagnosis, you may remember that I was not born with type 1, nor did I inherit it, and no one in my family in the 2 generations either prior to or since my initial diagnosis has experienced type 1. This latter fact is important to understand how a suspected, quote, environmental factor may have contributed to my diagnosis. While my siblings and I were exposed to all of the same factors growing up, with one very important exception, none has developed type 1. Considering all of these facts, you may consider me the outlier, the proverbial black sheep, the errant strain or branch on my family tree, if you think about it. So what was that one exception? Very simply, the physical trauma I experienced the evening of June 15, 1968. No one in my family had or has ever been victimized by such an incident. So you might rightfully ask, well, what medical basis can I point to support this claim that this event triggered the onset of my diabetic symptoms? In looking back at that night and recalling the injuries I sustained, it appears to me my internal injuries were more severe than it was possible to diagnose or even treat at that time. The available diagnostic tools of that time were not sophisticated enough to identify real injury of the type I'm referring to. Normal diagnostic tools like imaging studies, things like CT scans and MRI studies, were just beginning to roll out in the healthcare industry, and certainly not at the local community hospital where I was treated right after the incident. They may have helped to screen for suspected trauma to my internal organs if they had been available. It's worth noting also that pancreatic enzyme panel lab tests, the go-to tests these days that measure pancreatic function, were not introduced until years later in the early 1970s. Recently, I was required to have what's called a C-peptide lab test run on me to confirm I was truly a type 1 diabetic. This was interesting, but it was needed to qualify me for a new set of insulin pump supplies. Really? I'm not exaggerating here. By doing this, I realized that one test, the C-peptide test, did not become available to medical provider until years later in the early 1970s. This would have been a very definitive test for establishing way back in 1968 if my pancreas was compromised and able to sustain insulin production following the incident. So in hindsight, the diagnostic work that might have been done immediately after my trauma to determine the extent of my internal injuries simply did not exist. This was even true in the 3 to 4 months afterwards. What I found most interesting in reviewing the research on pancreatic trauma myself is become clear that the trauma is very uncommon. In fact, it occurs in only 4% of all abdominal injuries that appear at hospitals. I don't think there's any question that I did experience abdominal injuries that night. Luckily, there was no bleeding, no fractured ribs or anything like that. But the physical beatings I took that night assaulted my internal organs. I was punched in the face and the ribs multiple times. After falling to the ground, I was also kicked in the ribs and stomach repeatedly. So what trauma might have been hidden to clinicians who treated me that night in 1968? The research I cited in the intro to today's video podcast specifically mentioned how the closeness of the pancreas itself to vital abdominal organs such as the stomach, liver, small bowel, and the duodenum puts the pancreas at very high risk whenever these organs are assaulted, as they were that night. The research points out that whenever trauma occurs to the areas around these major internal organs, the outcomes for the pancreas itself frequently are, quote, morbidity and mortality. In my case, mortality was the outcome. Not to me, obviously, but to my pancreas. Yes, it literally began to die. I began to lose pancreatic function shortly thereafter, and certainly have none now. This was the environmental trigger I've mentioned has been mentioned in the literature that I believe set in motion the slow road of metabolic changes that ended in a total shutdown of my pancreas over the ensuing 3 to 4 months in 1968, following my being beaten up. What was that slow road like? At the end of the intro to my video today, I quoted how the American Diabetes Association describes what that slow process is like over 3 stages. I believe it's true because that is exactly what my life was like in the 3 to 4 months following my trauma. It stated, quote, type 1 diabetes develops over 3 stages. In the first 2 stages, most people don't experience any symptoms. This was more or less true for me in its earlier stages. However, it continues by saying, quote, but they all are eventually revealed and diagnosed in stage 3. This was definitely true for me. They came suddenly, and I was completely unprepared. Personally, there were noticeable changes to my life in the ensuing months following my trauma, not all of which were physical. I talk about some of those in my book. The most obvious, biggest change to me during that period was first the loss of social interactions with my closest friends. Here I mean the evening and weekend varieties we formerly had prior to June 15. Sadly, at that time, our parents and us all feared new and possibly equally more violent confrontations might resume with the local greaser bullies in our neighborhood. News had spread that my family was pursuing legal action with authorities against the family of the perpetrators of the June 15th assault. Being out during evening hours was viewed as risky at best and dangerous at its worst. We feared the bully crowd might take their intimidation tactics to an even more violent level. My friends were fearful for obvious reasons. Unfortunately to me, but understandably from their perspective, they suspected being seen with me or hanging out with me might place them again in even greater harm's way than before with the bully crowd. In writing my book, a conversation I had with one of my close friends, Billy, who was with me the night of that assault, brought to mind this remark. In that conversation, he shared just how serious the threats from local greasers were in our northwest side Chicago neighborhood. Billy shared with me, and I quote here, quote, I was attacked several times by greasers on the streets before and after that night, but I was always able to outrun them, end of quote, jumping fences, hiding in backyard shrubs and bushes. Again, once they cornered me on a local neighborhood porch. This was another incident Billy described. The homeowner of that house just happened by chance to interrupt the ambush that occurred on his front porch. By opening the front door, he flashed a pistol at the attackers. After Billy mentioned that, I've never forgotten that conversation, and it can't capture some of the tensions that existed in the neighborhood at that time amid all that was going on that summer of 1968 in the country at large. While this was happening, I briefly considered getting ready to try out for my high school JV football team that summer for the fall season. But my former physical vitality began to fade. As this happened and became clearer to me, I didn't think I could maintain the physical energy and stamina to balance both daily football practices with academic studies. I knew this would be a challenge, remembering what it was like the preceding fall when I was on the sophomore football team. After fall high school classes resumed, however, I became aware of small physical changes that were happening, but I tended to dismiss them. Remember, no family members or relatives of mine had ever dealt with the symptoms of type 1 before summer of 1968. Frequent urination, thirst, weight loss, and even overeating to compensate for the late weight loss that I was experiencing became much more common. I mistakenly and largely ignored them, thinking these were part of some normal growth period during adolescence. In that moment, I began to search for distractions to take my mind away from the social and physical changes that were happening around me. I remember one option was taking a driver's ed class so I could prepare myself to begin driving my dad's car. In my adolescent innocence and naivete, I thought this might be a first step to basically reconnecting socially with my friends. Not a bad idea. The idea. Getting my driver's permit and license seemed like the natural thing to do, just like most teenagers were doing at the time. Well, it did occur many months later, but in the short run, it was never meant to happen. In the final week of a series of nighttime classes in October 1968, I began to feel exceptionally fatigued. My eyesight during class sessions began to dim. Images became more hazy and blurry. Upon returning home one evening, I felt unconscious, comatose, and was taken by ambulance to Illinois Masonic Medical Center. I was admitted to the hospital with a blood sugar of 720. Yes, 720. Just to illustrate how dangerous and how much of an outlier that reading was, if you look at most charts that display a scale of blood sugar readings and how those convert to A1C scores, a reading of 720 blood sugar does not even appear. It is literally off the charts. Even to this day, I get a little scared to think how close I was to knocking on heaven's door that evening at the hospital. My immediate family and grandparents were around me for that evening. I remained unconscious in a coma for 24 hours. There were several ironies of that hospital episode. The most memorable was my physical awareness and feeling coming out of the coma. The morning after that night, I felt comatose, experiencing elevated fever, vomiting, and strong convulsions. Strangely, when I woke up, I never felt as refreshed and clear-headed as I did that morning. Never in my entire lifetime, before or since that night, have I truly felt just as refreshed and having a fresh start at life as I did that morning. In many ways, that night, the darkest hour was before dawn, and I survived it. There are a few other ironies that followed me in the 3 weeks I spent in the hospital recovering from my diagnosis and coma, but you'll have to read my book for more details about those. In hindsight, it's become clearer to me that the events of the evening of June 15, 1968 altered my life in more ways than I ever imagined they would at the time. I'm convinced they were the environmental trigger that set in motion the metabolic changes leading to my type 1 diagnosis just 3 months later. The ADA's description of how type 1 evolves was spot on. 3 stages, with symptoms hardly noticed by anyone in stages 1 and 2. In only the final stage are all changes and symptoms revealed. I'm not sure how, if at all, it would have changed my life story had the connection between my trauma and type 1 diagnosis had been more firmly and quickly established. Would the clinicians who worked with and on me that first night of June 15, continuing through mid-October, would have they been able to intervene more aggressively to change the trajectory of my physiological changes to avert my type 1? I don't know, maybe not. But was almost a unique beginning to a new life for me. By the way, the same was true for my family, which I will share in my next podcast. As I've read the stories of other type 1s, I haven't run across anything similar, even to this day. So yes, the beginning was different, but the 56 plus years that have followed have not only been different, but honestly equally unexpected. I say that in a very positive and upbeat manner. My upcoming podcast will convey just how the juice is and has been worth the squeeze in my lifetime, as I've embraced my everyday challenges managing my type 1 diabetes. Stay tuned for more about that. Just as a side note, if you're looking for a great song to inspire you on your daily journey managing type 1, I suggest listening to one of my favorites. It's When You Believe by Whitney Houston and Mariah Carey. It's the theme song, too, of all things, a Disney movie, The Prince of Egypt. Oddly, I've never seen the movie since it was released in 1998, but today I listen to the song routinely when I exercise, whether it's walking, bicycling, spending time on my rowing or on my elliptical machine. There are two lyrics that always grab me. The first, quote, "Hope is frail but hard to kill." And second, quote, "Who knows what miracles you can achieve? Somehow you will if you believe," unquote. Boy, if there's a message when you face the daily challenges of managing your type 1, just listen to those lyrics. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, if you have any comments, questions, or other feedback you'd like to share about this podcast, I definitely welcome it. Visit my podcast survey at, again, fanlist.com/the juice. I repeat, fanlist.com/the juice. Please also help me by donating to support the publication of my upcoming book at my GoFundMe page. In your phone or computer, type GoFundMe Brian Balicki in your browser search engine. My picture and story will appear there. In closing, once again, thank you for your time, interest, and support. Signing off for now, cheerfully, Brian Balicki. Have a great day.